China's economic boom is losing steam.
Chinese consumers are spending less. Chinese factories are producing less.
This is probably the worst day for Xi Jinping.
The massive flow away from China right now.
Well, it's clear that the Chinese economy, the recovery is weak.
There are many speculators in the world who stated some time ago that they are almost convinced that China will collapse in the near future. For some, such an opinion is surreal and probably fits into the Washington-controlled narrative, while for others, this bold thesis is as correct as possible. Point of view depends on the point of sitting, as the saying goes. On the other hand, China has had years of undeniably superior economic growth, performing an economic miracle on an unprecedented scale. After all, a country of 1,300,000,000 people with a per capita GDP of just over $300 in 1990 reached $12,500 in 2022, still a few thousand behind the Americans, but with the size of the country, the population potential, and how hard it is to control something so large, the success of the Chinese is undeniable and even more spectacular than that of other countries. China, however, will face the demons of its own system in the coming years, which, although it has determined growth so far, may end up undermining it. Remember, this doesn't have to happen at all. It's just a forecast. Exactly the same as the one about the weather in your phones. One day shows that it will be hot 30 degrees, and yet suddenly a storm comes and it cools down. It pours all day long, because the cloud was guided differently by the wind. Such a somewhat elaborate Homeric comparison should perfectly convey to you what is happening in geopolitics as well as in many scientific publications. These are the scenarios that will happen, and it is China's collapse that we need to focus on because we have the data that could lead to such a turn of events.
不确定性比较强的这样的一种状态，这个其实对于中小企业，就是承受风险能力比较差的这些中小企业来说呢，是非常致命的。所以呢，我们看到在这个3、4月份，大量的中小企业可能是出现了一种这个缩减规模的这样的一种状态，就是他预料到说这个未来的不确定性很强，那么它可能会出现，比如说抛售资产，或者是一种保命的这样的一种心态就出现了。那么这个就使得它的这个招聘需求就大幅度的。
Chinese stocks and indexes are falling along with industrial production, while unemployment is rising rapidly, with a record of 20.4% in April. According to a study by researchers at Columbia and Xi'an Jiaotong universities, at least a quarter of China's college graduates are underemployed, and it's a long list of problems that are piling up, not helped by deglobalization and a fierce geopolitical struggle with the United States. That's why today, it's time to realistically assess how real the prospect of China's collapse actually is, and what it will mean for the world. Without further ado, here we go. The whole world is now focused on one event, the rivalry between two superpowers that claim the role of global hegemon. On one side of the barricade we have China, on the other the United States. The race is in full swing, everything counts. Access to resources, access to data, demographics, economic development, military development, and much, much more. Americans are already accustomed to this race, they have it written in their blood. It is a certain characteristic that builds the strength of this nation, the desire to dominate everything and everyone, big wins. And here the question arises, how much can the Chinese endure living in competition and constant tension? China has actually been in this race for only about 40 years. Ever since, under the regime changes initiated by Deng Xiaoping, the middle country partially opened up to the West. And here's the key element that we'll highlight for ourselves now on the screen. Opened to the West. With the establishment of special economic zones in Shanghai and later in the Pearl River Valley, foreign investors came to China and opened their first factories there. This was the first phase of the economic boom.
Unlike Mao and many others, he could understand what modernization took and how far China was behind. He was also extraordinarily good in dealing with foreigners. He would start off with a very quick kind of some funny thing he said, and then he would quickly zero in. He was not as philosophical as Mao, but he was very direct, and people liked him. When Reagan saw him, he said afterward, he doesn't seem like a communist. He's a guy you could work with. So it's quite remarkable ability.
The technology that was arriving also gave inspiration to Chinese entrepreneurs, and the authorities themselves did everything to extract as much know-how as possible. The economy exploded a while later. Growth rates were not 5, 10, or 15% per year, but even over 30%, which is unprecedented in the world looking at the size and population of the country. So, the rotten capitalist West instilled in the Chinese themselves the spirit of capitalism. The first manufacturers arose, who, although under state control, created large companies and made gigantic fortunes, and with them the country began to develop at an unprecedented rate. Thus, today, for example, one of the richest Chinese who first entered the era of Chinese capitalism is the 69-year-old founder and chairman of beverage company Nongfu Spring and majority owner of Beijing Wantai Biological Pharmacy Enterprise. Zhong Shanshan has a net worth of $62.3 billion, as much as the entire economy of Serbia. In China, however, we still have a centrally planned state, with the Communist Party of China at the head, which has influence over the largest state-owned companies, but also economic strategy. Nor can it be said that the country has no democracy, and that party members don't change. That's a lie. Elections are at the local level, and ordinary Chinese people can also join the party, although it's extremely difficult. However, a centrally planned model with elements of strict censorship, social control, a requirement to share know-how for foreign companies, and alienation means that this shutdown could end up similar to the China Wall Initiative, which was supposed to protect China from enemies so that they wouldn't take its technology. What's more, continuing to instill in the young that Mao is their undisputed idol, the leader of all time, obviously solidifies the position of the Communist Party of China, but at the same time builds up a threat that has already changed the system in this country once. Under Mao, poor young people bought the myth of utopian communism, where you take from the rich, give to the poor. Now the young don't have housing because it's too expensive. They don't have jobs because too many have college. They don't have much if they aren't outstanding or their family was poor.
可能会有一点点关系吧，就如果找不到的话，就会想来这边拜一下，祈求更好的工作。
有，我觉得很有，
对，压力很大，
因为压力太大了嘛，然后就是所以才会出来各种散心啊，然后逛逛寺庙啊，拜一下神什么之类的。现在感觉大部分的大学生就是遍地走了，然后还有研究生，他的学业的那个门槛在不断的提升，就高学历的人越来越多，然后也有很多的学生，他们更多的寄托在于考公跟考研上面。然后找工作就会越来越难，因为大家都在卷。
The revolution came from the young, and now they can lead the revolution again by overthrowing the government. One example of how they are already revolting is, for example, Dangping, which is a common idea promoted on social media. It is based on the fact that it is supposed to reject the rat race instead. It is better to play, to relax, than to work in the 996 model. That is 12 hours of work 6 days a week, and this has so far been the engine of the Chinese economy, guaranteeing its growth and productivity. Moreover, the young introduced communism. The young wanted to overthrow communism in Tiananmen Square, and the young will either overthrow it or contribute to an even deeper indoctrination. Analysts who follow the Chinese political scene agree. Xi Jinping has secured his third term well, ruling China for the longest time since Mao. The PRC chairman, unlike his predecessors, no longer wants to operate in secret. He is convinced that China is powerful enough to dictate its terms in the region without worrying too much about a reaction from the West, especially the United States. Human rights abuses in Xinjiang province, the subjugation of Hong Kong in 2020 through the introduction of the National Security Act, and the growing military intimidation of Taiwan have reinforced the PRC's sense of threat in the international community. This is all the more so because the middle state regularly talks with Russia and supports its attack on Ukraine.
决定自身立场，始终坚定站在和平一边。站在对话一边，站在历史正确一边。我期待继续通过各种方式同普京总统保持密切沟通，共同引领中俄关系行稳致远。
As Jagannath Panda, an expert on the Far East at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, points out, although Xi Jinping has consolidated his power and quelled internal dissent, China is moving increasingly toward totalitarianism and is rapidly losing its carefully built competitive edge over the rest of the world. China's main benchmark, Hang Seng, is performing dismally this year against Korea's KOSPI and Japan's Nikkei 225, not to mention US indices. China is losing the race for AI and semiconductors, and we faced something similar during the Cold War when there was a space race and an arms race. At that time, the US still came up with the so-called Star Wars, but that was only going to further burn out the Soviet economy.
Let us turn to the very strengths in technology that spawned our great industrial base and that have given us the quality of life we enjoy today. What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
The Americans can reach for similar weapons even now, and China is already on the brink anyway. Debt in the Chinese economy reached a record 279.7% in the first quarter of 2023, expanding 7.7 percentage points from the previous 3 months. The city of Hegang, which lies close to the border with Russia, is buckling under the weight of debt and has had to resort to shock tightening therapy in 2021. A similar fate could soon befall many other Chinese provinces, Bloomberg agency notes. Adding to the debt burden is China's real estate developers, and a little less than a year ago, Evergate, whose assets are close to those generated by half of Poland's economy, came close to collapse. Investors in corporate bond markets are losing any residual hope of a recovery in China's real estate market. Corporate bonds in the Middle Kingdom and several other Asian countries are continuing to discount, driven by falling housing sales by Chinese developers and their subsequent debt service problems. The risk premium on bonds from the Bloomberg calculated Asian High Yield Index was at its highest in a year, after real estate securities were repriced by 26% in 1 month alone. Glass futures on the Zhengzhou Commodity Exchange fell nearly 20% in April. China accounts for half of the world's plate glass production, using it mainly in construction and automobiles. LNG in China is at its cheapest in nearly 2 years, illustrating the decline in demand from industry and transportation. These figures are the tip of the iceberg. Nevertheless, the worst will not come this year. It will all build up over the next 10 years. China, in 2022, saw its population decline for the first time in history, and this is only a harbinger of the worst. According to forecasts, in 2023, the world leader of the list of countries with the highest population will be India. By 2030, the population of the middle country will decrease by about 30 million people. That's a little less than live in Poland, while already in 2050 it will be 100 million Chinese, and in 2100 there will be only about 800 million left, which will not allow to maintain the position of hegemon, as the United States will have a little less. What the Chinese authorities have been doing lately is discouraging the population from continuing in this system, foolishly moving back to the era of extreme communism using Mao's notes. Wealthy investors have been spooked by China's geopolitical aspirations, including uncertainty in the context of restrictions like those during COVID, or many others like tacitly supporting Russia in its war with Ukraine. The chance of China losing ground significantly is high. The giant on clay legs is wobbling, but will it fall? That remains to be seen. For my part, that's it for today. Thanks, keep it up. Cheers.